Now we have already covered two definitions. The first was the contract of sale, the second was goods. Now let us try to cover other definitions which are given by the Sale of Goods Act 1930. The first of those is buyer. Who is a buyer? Buyer means a person who buys or agrees to buy goods. Now this is very important. I know buyer is a person who buys the goods, but it's given buyer is a person who buys or agrees to buy. This is very important here. Agrees to buy. That means he is agreeing to buy in future. There are two conditions mentioned here. First, he either buys it now or he agrees to buy in future. So, even though a buyer does not buy the goods now, he agrees to buy in future, he will still be called as a buyer. I'll give you an example to explain this. Let's say there's a person A and there's a person B. A tells B that I want to purchase your bike for, let's say, 20,000 rupees. So A tells B that he'll purchase his bike for 20,000 rupees. B agrees to this contract and they both exchange the goods and money there and then. So this is a normal sale transaction where the buyer is buying the goods. A is the buyer who's buying the bike. So he's buying the bike there and then. I'll give you one more example. A tells B that you give me a bike and I'll give you 20,000 rupees, but this transaction will happen after 10 days. That is, I will purchase the bike from you after 10 days. After 10 days, you give me the bike, I'll give you the money. This transaction is happening now. So I can say this transaction is happening in present, this is happening in future. This transaction, the first transaction, is a sale transaction. The second transaction is agreement to sell transaction. They both are agreeing to sell it in future. So, in first case, A will be called as buyer. In second case, also A will be called as the buyer. So, buyer is a person who currently buys the goods or who agrees to buy it in future. Agrees to buy it in future. So, either the ownership is transferred from seller to buyer there and then at the time of the contract, or it is agreed that the ownership will get transferred on a future date. In both the cases, that person who gets the ownership will be called as the buyer. So, who's the seller then? Seller is a person who sells or agrees to sell the goods. Buyer is a person who buys or agrees to buy the goods. Seller would be the person who sells or agrees to sell the goods. Now, in both these cases, B would be considered as the seller. B would be considered as the seller. In first case, B sells the goods there and then. That is, he transfers the ownership at that time only, at the time of contract only. However, in the second case, B agrees to transfer the ownership. That is, he agrees to sell the goods after 10 days. In both the cases, B will be considered as the seller. So, be the transaction a sale transaction, or it may be an agreement to sell transaction. An agreement to sell transaction is a transaction which happens in future. You agree to sell in future. You agree to buy in future. So, the first transaction is a sale transaction. The second transaction is an agreement to sell transaction. Okay. So in both these cases, A will be the buyer, B will be the seller. Now, one thing I'll like to tell you here is a buyer means a person who buys or agrees to buy the goods for a price. At the same time, a seller is a person who sells or agrees to sell the goods for a price. They both purchase and sell it for a price. That goes without saying. I told you, price is an essential feature of a transaction of sale. So even if it is not mentioned and it is told that the transaction is a sale transaction, it goes without saying that it would have happened for a price only. Okay.